Hello. I think that we should start. We are with some delay. So welcome to the session on tourism and urban conflict, a very hot topic, including in Portugal. We have two presentations, three researchers. We have first presentation, BEGOña, ARAMAYONA. This is a collective presentation, so it is BEGOña and SUSANA BATEL from Universidade Autónoma de Madrid. BEGOña and SUSANA present a paper with the title Tourism Protests and Nimby, Analyzing Bairro Alto's Lisboa and Latinas, Madrid, Residents' Contestations Against Urban Challenges. The second presentation will be made by SOFIA PINTO, Universidade Católica Portuguesa. There is a mistake in this. And the presentation have the title Alfama Walls of Fame, Framing Street Art and Graffiti as Assertions of Democratic Authority in a Gentrified Neighborhood. So 15 minutes to the presentations. So BEGOña, start. The floor is yours, please.
Hi. Okay. Hello. Thank you for the presentation, Fatima. So I'm going to present the work that I'm doing with Susana Batel, who works here in this house at ISCTE. That's an interesting intercultural relationship. And I'm doing my PhD at the University Autónoma of Madrid. This is a work in progress, so we will really appreciate any recommendation, any critique, any literature recommendation. So please don't be ashamed. So what we're doing is a comparison between two neighborhoods. One is that is Bairro Alto, which is here in Lisbon. Many of you might know it, and La Latina, which is in Madrid. Both are central neighborhoods, which are in the historical centers of each city, Lisbon and Madrid, and they have experienced similar changes of urban change, of course with many differences, but some of them very similar. They both underwent urban regeneration processes between the 70s and 90s. Although in the case of La Latina, which is the photographs that you see on the right, Bairro Alto is on the left. In the case of La Latina, these processes were a bit earlier in comparison to Bairro Alto. At the same time, both of them have experienced an increase in nighttime economy and the commodification of nightlife. In both neighborhoods, there have been local protests and contestation against those changes, with the common thing that they were before this tourist boom that has happened in some southern Europe cities, and also before the tourism came as a motive for social organization in this southern Europe context. And now both of them, after these processes of change and contestation, have become milestones or very strategic enclaves in the touristic economy of both cities. So going to the protest, which is the issues that we would like to address. We are interested in what is common and different in two pre-boom protests. What is common? There are two very explicit things, which are these both were this what we call pre-boom protest, and also they both failed in their main goals, in their main explicit goals. So in the case of Barrio Alto, as you can see on the pictures on the left, there was this project of building a new condominium, luxury condominium, in an old church, Convento dos Inglesinhos. There was a very huge neighbor protest, but in the end, the luxury condominium was built. And in the case of La Latina, which is on the right, the main protest was built around the increase on nightlife. And even with this protest, the licenses for nightlife economy didn't stop increasing. So these are the two things that we see in common. What the different things, of course there are many, but we would like to address here three of them. One is the temporal gap. In the case of Barrio Alto, the protests were exerted during the 2000 and 2004, and in the case of La Latina, it was since 2006 until now. They are still protesting. Another difference between the two of them is the social composition of the protest. This is something that I will talk about later in detail. And the third one is the reaction of the local municipality, the Cámara of each city, and other third-party members. That means neighbors, but not only neighbors, who made opinions about these protests through the website or through daily reactions. In the case of Barrio Alto, the protest was since the very beginning depicted as Nimby, which is the not in my backyard concept. I don't know if you know this concept, but I will later on explain a little bit. And in the case of La Latina, there was no, let's say, bad reaction about the protest. So it was kind of a legitimate protest for the local municipality and other actors. So we are interested in these two examples, not only to see the particularities of each protest, but especially to see what they can add to the current debates about the tourist city, taking the fact that they were accepted before tourism was a very general motive for social mobilization, as you may know. So our theoretical approach, I don't want to spend much time in this, but you can see the authors there. So we frame what is happening in these two cities in the frames of these localization processes in which there are multiple scales between the global and the local, and they operate most of the time at the same time. Also the work of Claire Colomb and Novi, which is now very important in the literature about tourism, and in general what this entertainment machine is doing on the cities, these public-private alliances which use leisure and tourism and the visitors' economy as a motor for growth at a local scale. We are very interested in these tensions, how these translate into specific tensions at a local scale. And there is incipient literature on this. There are some authors as Jordi Nofre, which works at Fixnova, Jorge Sequera, Cocola, who's from Barcelona, Colomb, as I already mentioned. If you're interested in any of those, we can talk about them later. What we want to offer is a new approach, or a complementary approach to understand those tensions, and for that we use mainly three concepts. One that is the moral ownership, who has the moral ownership of the places, especially places that have centuries of history, so how this moral ownership is built. And then you can go to the work of Sharon Suki, and etc. Also, we use these debates between Thomanet and Doreen Massey, which talk about the benefits and perils of parochial or very strong local attachments to places, and also this other global sense of places with Massey says that sometimes they can be reactionary. So it's a debate that is still alive. And also we use the new mobility paradigm with these authors that, well, now from the field of geography, they have interesting insights to talk about the tensions. So just to mention about the Nimby, this is a concept that was constructed in an Anglo-Saxon context in the beginning and then was transferred to other non-Anglo-Saxon academic and media contexts. It's basically the acronym of Not in My Backyard. That, it is something that both academics and media use to describe some type of protest which were meant to be exerted by selfish and irrational people who had hidden motives around the urban changes that were happening in their places, most of the time because they were accused of being moved by the defense of their property value interests. So there was also a very use of this concept in terms of how to overcome NIMBYism, how to overcome those type of protests, right? Then you have other authors such as the TICYUrb'18 who say, well, it's not a useful concept because it just delegitimizes any type of protest or is used strategically to delegitimize protest. So it's more a topic for researchers than a topic by itself. And also there's a big question about what are the impacts of the protest, which are, of course, are complex, as we will see. So one of the first things that we did when we started this Portuguese-Spanish relationship in order to talk about our different study cases was that it was essential for us to change the questions. So if one of the main questions about NIMBYism was that who are the protesters, who really are the protesters, we wanted to change that question around who people around the protest, how they performatively build their identities around the protest, and how protest is essential for building those identities. The second, I will explain that later. The second thing is, which are the protesters' motives? That's also that is very used in the NIMBY literature. So we wanted also to change that question because we thought it was more useful to understand what was happening, to the question of how moral ownerships are built around places and how this legitimacy of the protest is negotiated through time. And the third question was, well, which are the impacts? And especially talking about two protests that were, let's say, that they failed in their explicit goals, but which of the impacts we could see about this? So with the first question, what we found is that there was between these two protests, there was we needed to ask ourselves how the protest of Barrio Alto and how the protest of La Latina, who they depicted the problem and the person that embodied the problem in order to answer who are us. That is, so how them or the other is depicted says a lot about who I am or who are us. So what we find is that there was a common narrative in both places around the authentic neighborhood. That was like the defense of the urban village, a place that is very at a local scale, based on daily relationships, sometimes even using metaphors of a rural kind of living. And also there was this thing of the invasion, like almost in a word-like metaphor of who was coming. So there was a fear of losing this common heritage. The problem is what is a common heritage and what is behind this common heritage. What we find different between the two cases is that in the case of La Latina, the problem were the nighttime annoying revelers. They were depicted as having the effect of downscale the place in contrast to this idea of a novel and civilized place by elder homeowners who were mainly the characteristics of the protesters. In the case of Barrio Alto, the problem was depicted as the wealthier newcomers are coming due to this change, and this will upscale the place. This will mean price upscaling, etc. And the marginal and poor identity of a place will be replaced by this. Having the fact that these were middle-class artists and intellectuals who came to the neighborhood when this neighborhood was still a very in decline or abandoned place. So in relation to the protesters' motives, how these moral ownerships are built and how the legitimacy of the protest is negotiated, we thought that instead of asking ourselves what are the real motives of these protesters, we wanted to ask these other questions. And in the case of Barrio Alto, what we found is that, as I said, they were depicted since the very beginning as Nimby, as not the true Barrio Alto residents who wanted to keep their small village only for them, also by the local municipality. In the case of La Latina, both local municipality, both the press, the media, sorry, depicted these protesters as the genuine neighbors. And there was also a very interesting thing, and is that, especially in the case of Barrio Alto, not so much in the case of La Latina, they begin with very local concerns around their neighborhood, but especially in the case of Barrio Alto, they were forced to build another type of argumentation, which included a metropolitan scale or even a global scale, such as the increase of the visitors' economy or the loss of social and architectural heritage of the city. So what about the impacts? And I think that's my last one, yeah. What we found is that what this has to say about the current debates of the tourist city and the contestation of the tourist city. Well, Claire Colomb, you may know her, most of them you may know her, says that a common psychological impact of people that experience this type of changes of the tourist increase, the visitors' economy increase, etc., is a loss of sense of belonging through places. That's something that we found in both cases, both in Barrio Alto and in La Latina. There was a sense of something was losing around place. However, in each case, there was a different defense of certain people-place relationship, and that's what we wanted to address. Both had what Thomanet would say is a very parochial sense of being, very attached to places, and these both had contradictory effects. On the one hand, there was a very high potential of anti-globalization and anti-commodification of the changes that were happening. For example, there was a claim against the commodification of the use of public space, or there was this feeling kind of the attrezzo of the place for the visitors' economy. But at the same time, whereas in the case of La Latina was kind of reactionary, in the case of Barrio Alto had a much broader concern. There is something very, very paradoxical as well, and that is that this claim around the locality has been used in future reappropriations by other actors. For example, in the case of Barrio Alto, national and transnational student tourists, that's how some authors call it, have used this concept of the old village in the city as a way to appropriate this in a very different sense compared to the protesters that we were studying, and that's something very paradoxical. At the same time, and that's the last thing that I'm going to say, and I think it's very related to some of the presentations in the season before, there was a claim about the participatory decision processes, the need for them. But the question is, how can this happen in a context with an authoritarian legacy, like is the case of Portugal or Spain? And that's something funny because in the case of Barrio Alto, there was an explicit consciousness about the dictator's legacy around if people protesting or if the local municipality was listening or not, whereas in the case of La Latina, there was not such a common. There was not such a common, and that also, we can discuss it later, but for us is reflecting what it has to be with, it says something important about how Spanish middle classes or Portuguese middle classes are being built in each of these contexts with this past of an authoritarian legacy. I think it's, and that's all. Thank you very much. Obrigada.
Thank you for this interesting comparison between Portugal and Spain, Madrid and Lisboa, and for respecting the time, okay? And now we have Sofia Pinto.
Hi. So actually my PhD research is not about graffiti and tourism, it's about feminism and graffiti, but today I will speak about graffiti and tourism. This is a very personal topic for me. I'll explain. I've already presented a version of this research in a conference about Guy Debord, the Society of the Spectacle, where we could think about tourism as a flow of images and constructed by a flow of images, and graffiti as a way to counter hegemonic images. But anyway, so my presentation today results from my very own personal experience of living in Alfama in a time when mass tourism has forced so many of us to move to other districts of Lisbon. In March, I was also forced to move out from my home in Alfama due to the exponential rise in housing prices, and I was living there for the past 9 years. So. The right to inhabit the city center is a powerful idea conveyed by Henri Lefebvre's concepts of the right to the city. And he says, the right to the city legitimates the refusal to allow oneself to be removed from urban reality by a discriminatory and segregative organization. So in Lefebvre's perspective, the city historical center is a privileged place from which population are being deprived, only to be relegated to the suburbs and return as dispossessed tourists. In fact, the right to the city can be seen as a counter-discourse in favor of those who are marginalized, underprivileged, and dispossessed by, and here I quote David Harvey, consumerism, tourism, cultural and knowledge-based industries. Okay, so what's happening in Alfama? Here I will just talk a little bit about numbers. So Alfama district lost 22% of its residents between 2001 and 2011. Another survey focused on booking.com that does not even include the platform Airbnb. It compares Alfama to what's happening in the Gothic neighborhood in Barcelona, and Finally, Mendes says that we have already seen home prices in historically significant neighborhoods increase at rates far in excess of local incomes needed to support those prices. So I'm quoting these statistics that can situate what is happening in historical neighborhoods in Lisbon. But I'm also talking about these statistics because I am interested in an opposite approach, and by that I say a more personal or embodied approach to this issue. And by that I am proposing graffiti. I am proposing that graffiti can be a method of urban diagnosis. And going a little bit back to the right to the city, and this time relating it with graffiti, Lefebvre recognized graffiti as a potential disruption of normative discourses around capital, profits, or privatization. He also said that revolutionary events generally take place in the streets, a place where speech becomes writing, a place where speech can become savage, and by escaping rules and institutions, inscribe itself on walls. Indeed, the city surfaces become a way for the city user to publicly assert his or her existence and to politically claim his or her right to the city. Actions upon urban surfaces, such as walls, express the right to self-determination in the production and occupation of spaces, and a prerogative to use the city in defiance of exclusionary and suppressive properties and regulations. Furthermore, surfaces of the city speak of access, exclusion, and entitlement. Indeed, the study of surfaces could become a uniquely political and richly detailed field of urban spatial exploration. So here we have the right to the city as a right to the surface, which has been proposed by graffiti scholar Sabina Andron, and a right also to the city center. Okay, not right now. Yeah. So while living in Alfama, the last months I lived in Alfama, I noticed the emergence of a fair amount of graffiti and other similar interventions against mass tourism. I photographed and documented several of these interventions randomly encountered in the streets of that neighborhood during October 2017 and November also of 2017 and January 2018. My purpose consists in framing these interventions as a symptom and result of the problem of forced evictions due to mass tourism. So now I'm going to show, some of these. I have not time here to analyze these pictures, but okay, so this was taken near Castelo, São Jorge, which is actually the touristic site visited by more tourists in Portugal. Here you have another photo that was taken near the flea market, and in English it would, well, this is a poem, kind of, and it could be translated as tourist, tourist, sore to the eye, and then another person, I assume another person, wrote, and good for the purse, yeah, for the money. And here you have nearby Miradouro, Santa Luzia, and those are slogans. There were other kinds of interventions, right? But mass tourism equals human pollution. And here, very interestingly, you will notice now I photographed the whitewashing of the walls, which really happened really fast comparing to other graffiti writing like tags that were not whitewashed from the walls of that neighborhood, but curiously or not, these interventions would be erased really quickly. So you have here, so in October, in November it was already gone. This is Mirador das Portas do Sol, and it was gone also very quickly. And this one was very big and was the most short-lived, I think. Okay. So, Graffiti can be considered as self-authorized pictures, characters, and forms created in or applied to surfaces in the urban space that intentionally seek communication. I draw attention to the fact that graffiti is here considered as self-authorized practices, instead of being merely ascribed to the domain of illegality. Indeed, a prevalent trope in the discourse around graffiti is its illegal nature, that connotes these practices with vandalism, antisocial behavior, or criminal damage. However, recent contributions in graffiti scholarship have moved towards a reconceptualization of who authorizes who or what or where in the domain of public space. So Kurt Ivansen argues for thinking about the diverse practices of graffiti and street art not so much as confrontation with authority, but as assertions of authority. This means to think about graffiti more than an oppositional stance against legal frameworks in the city. In other words, to go beyond the traditional dichotomy of graffiti against the law, which singles one as good and the other as evil. And if you singling one as, well, which one is the good and which one is the evil is a matter of perspective, right? So conflating the notion of authority with that of authorship, Ivansen claims that graffiti and street artists struggle to be the authors of their inscriptions on the public surfaces, and in doing so exercise a kind of authority which also confers these practices with a legitimate responsibility associated with agency. In addition, the ubiquity, prevalence, and insistence of graffiti, despite legislating frameworks, demonstrated the limitations of public entities of exercising their authority. Thus, there are different entities in the city, each with different authorities, each with their own scope of action, potential, and limitations, and all compete with each other. While surfaces in the city are subjected to urban policies and public management that define which actions are proper and which actions are not, this existing vertical ordering is daily challenged by graffiti practices. This conflict occurs in the surface of the city walls as graffiti becomes visible to the city user who is invited to read them. A direct channel of communication opens between the graffiti writer and the city user without any other mediators. Thus, graffiti addresses someone, is meant to invoke a reader, it seeks to communicate something to someone, and besides the city user, it can also be the tourist or even the police. By observing, so finally, I'm going to my concluding remarks. By observing, photographing, documenting, and appreciating urban writings and interventions on the walls in the historical center of Lisbon, I propose that urban surfaces and self-authorized interventions may provide for ways of expression, communication, and diagnosis. The emergence of this graffiti, together with the increased impact of tourism indicated by recent statistics, suggests that the social balance between tourism and the local population may have been unsettled. In this sense, I believe that walls and other urban surfaces can be considered as a form of urban diagnosis that may complement or provide alternative readings to official statistics and other data analysis based on figures. Furthermore, these practices aim to point out, denounce, or reclaim situations of special urban injustice that may be ignored or masked by hegemonic discourses. In this case, the degradation of the cohesion of local neighborhoods and the communities, and the forceful evictions of the population from the historical center of Lisbon due to mass tourism. Through an assertion of democratic authority, graffiti is a direct means to act upon the urban surface and transform it, giving voice to who is being silenced. And finally, I would like to end with this quote: "The urban interface is like a skin that carries the marks of the emotions of the citizen." Okay, thank you.
Thank you, and for respecting the time also. Thank you very much. Now we can have a debate, questions. Please.
Okay. Boa tarde. I'm sorry, I'm just going to have to ask for your comprehension that we are a little bit behind schedule. And since we are behind schedule, what we would suggest is that the two remaining authors present their work, and then we have a little round of debate outside, because we have a session that needs to start at 5:30 sharp. Okay, so if you don't mind, take notes of your questions, and we will debate them later with the authors and the moderator, if she can.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Okay.